The first Mustangs reached British airfields under cloud-washed skies in the spring of 1942, their olive-drab skins still smelling faintly of California sun and factory dope. They rolled across the perimeter tracks of RAF fields in Suffolk and Kent like strangers unsure of their welcome. They were not the glamorous thoroughbreds of newsreel legend, not yet. They were simply NA-73 and NA-91 airframes with Allison engines, compact, clean, and built not for soaring duels at altitude, but for a war of mud-level reconnaissance, fast strikes, and tactical scouting. Pilots eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. RAF No. 5-1 Squadron and No. 2 Squadron had taken them first, to replace worn Tomahawks and elderly Lysanders. The Mustang sat low and sleek, its laminar flow wing smooth enough to look somehow incomplete. It did not boast the proud greenhouse canopy of a Spitfire. Early versions trapped the pilot beneath framed perspex like a tank hatch, and the engine Allison V1710, single-stage, single-speed supercharger, was known in British circles as an engine that breathed well only where the air was thick and dirty. The first sorties over France confirmed the impression. Down low, at treetop height along the Pas de Calais, the Mustang ran like a greyhound unleashed. Its radiator scoop, a graceful keel beneath the fuselage, smoothed the air and spit it out as if the machine itself exhaled speed. Pilots wrote home marveling this American fighter could cruise faster at 500 feet than some aircraft could dive. It sipped fuel where Spitfires gulped it. It carried cameras or light bombs with ease. It was cool running, stable, deadly in a high-speed pass, hard to catch, impossible to shake once it slipped away to the deck. But climb above 15,000 feet, certainly above 20,000, and the mask slipped. The Allison engine, a proud and hard-working power plant, began to labor like a marathoner choking on thin air. The supercharger, optimized for low and medium altitudes, could not feed enough pressure into the cylinders. RPM bled, manifold pressure sagged. The Mustang grew sluggish, unresponsive, its voice flattening into a tired drone. RAF test memoranda recorded the truth in the dry tone of engineers. Performance superior below 15,000 feet. Marked deficiency above 20,000. Not suitable for escort of high-altitude bomber formations. Another entry added a sentence that future historians would quote as if it were prophecy. Airframe potential considerable. Limiting factor, power plant. The American officers visiting from 8th Air Force Headquarters studied those words and nodded grimly. Their coming air war over Europe would be waged not at hedge height but in the cold, bright altitudes where contrails hung like scars. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly at 25,000 feet or more, where machine gun belts glinted with frost and fingers numbed inside thick gloves. Up there, the Luftwaffe waited with sleek Messerschmitts and rugged Focke-Wulfs tuned for high-altitude climbing kills. A fighter that gasped at 20,000 feet would not survive the climb to meet them. It would arrive late, slow, and already out of breath. The RAF used the Mustangs where they excelled: low-level reconnaissance over northern France, bomber interdiction, canal-busting runs, strikes on rail lines and airfields. Squadron diaries from No. 2 Squadron recorded missions at mast height, where trees blurred into green streaks and church steeples flashed past like bayonets pointed at the sky. A flight lieutenant wrote, "At 100 feet she is magnificent. One feels she was born there." Another scribbled after returning from a dawn sortie, "We outran 2 19s on the deck. Could not climb away, but no need. We simply left them on the ground behind us." And yet, in briefing rooms and engineering offices, a frustration coiled like a spring. The Mustang's wing, the first true production laminar flow surface on a fighter, promised more. The radiator duct hinted at the Meredith-effect, compressing heated air into a slipstream that actually generated thrust. The Merlin engine in a Spitfire demonstrated every day what a two-stage supercharger could do. Everyone could see the ingredients of greatness, misaligned but present, waiting for someone to rearrange them. In Washington and Dayton, Allison engineers defended their design. Their engine had been built to Navy requirements years before compact, reliable, efficient. It had powered P-40 Warhawks across the deserts and jungles of half the globe. Turbo superchargers, those brilliant, bulky, duct-ridden organs that let American interceptors like the P-38 breathe at 30,000 feet, were deemed too complex, too heavy, too precious for the Mustang's original Army role. The Mustang had not been intended for the deep strategic escort mission that now defined the war. Strategy had moved faster than procurement. Meanwhile, in England, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory and his subordinates debated the coming storm. Bomber Command pressed its own night offensive. 8th Air Force prepared to test the doctrine of daylight precision bombing. And those bombers would need shepherds, fighters with lungs capable of breathing in the stratosphere. The Spitfire could fight there, yes, but it could not travel far. Its graceful elliptical wings held fuel lightly, like a bird made for sprints, not migrations. Drop tanks helped, but not enough. The P-40 could not climb. The P-39 and P-400 lacked altitude performance. The P-38, with its twin-boom silhouette and turbo-fed Allisons, had promise, but supply was thin and maintenance heavy. And so the 8th Air Force looked at the young Mustang and saw both opportunity and inadequacy. A British squadron commander summed it up at a conference in Hendon that June. She is a knife-razor keen at the ribs of the Reich's coast, useless against the throat of Berlin. Pilots, as always, distilled truth down to a muttered line on a damp dispersal field. A lovely bird, but she chokes up high. Yet even then, the aircraft whispered of what it could become. On test stands at Hucknall and Farnborough, Rolls-Royce engineers gossiped over tea about that laminar flow wing, that sleek radiator channel, that eerie combination of grace and hunger. Some of them wondered aloud whether the Americans truly understood what they had built. Power, real, deep-lunged power, might transform this low-altitude racer into something far more dangerous. Across the channel, on the enemy side, German intelligence noticed the new fighter, but did not mark it as a primary threat. Luftwaffe field evaluations called it swift at low level and unsuitable for interception duties at height. They did not fear it. They barely remembered its name. But in the quiet corners of British airfields on test pads where ground crews warmed engines in the early mist, where exhaust curled like incense around men who knew machines as intimate companions, there grew a private certainty. The airframe was right. The feel was right. Something slept beneath the skin, waiting not for invention, but for the proper heart. A low-slung fighter crouched on the grass, its propeller ticking as it cooled after another cross-channel dash, oil damp along its belly. Ground crews pushed it into a revetment, unaware that history would one day trace legends back to these understated mornings. Engineers gathered over blueprints and talked in measured tones about supercharger stages and boost pressures, about airflow and heat rejection, about the razor-thin edge between drag and lift. The Mustang was not yet a savior, not yet a symbol. It was merely a promise brilliant at the wrong altitude, fearsome, below a ceiling it could not break, a racehorse stabled in the wrong stable. But honor has a way of finding machines built with the right soul. And somewhere between Chelmsford rain and Californian aluminum, between British skepticism and American ambition, between disappointment at 20,000 feet and glory waiting 10,000 feet higher, the Mustang waited. It did not know that another engine, one born across an ocean, would soon graft itself to its bones. It only knew this. It could run. And one day, it would learn how to climb. Chapter 2. A Heart Transplanted. Autumn 1942, Spring 1943, to 800 words. It began not with a dramatic order from a general's desk, but with engineers in brown shopcoats standing over a stripped Mustang fuselage in a Rolls-Royce test bay at Hucknall. Rain tapped on corrugated walls, a Merlin engine, two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the very breath of high altitude waited on a cradle like an art prepared for surgery. Someone whispered the line that would later harden into legend. If the Mustang has a flaw, It is not in the airframe. Across the channel, Luftwaffe flak towers watched contrails drift like chalk strokes across a pale sky. Up there, B-17 formations lumbered through bursts of black smoke. Below, the Allison Mustang chased trains and shot up radar stations at mast height, unseen by those who believed air superiority lived only above 20,000 feet. But in Britain's workshops, the future was already loosening its fists. Rolls-Royce test report, October 1942. Engine installation complete. Mustang fitted with Merlin 61. Initial climb promising. High-altitude characteristics markedly improved. An understatement, thin as tea. For when the starter whined and the 12 cylinders caught a rough cough, then a clear metallic roar, the Mustang changed cast. The engine note alone seemed to sharpen the air. It no longer growled like a low-flying predator. It sang like something that belonged in the cold blue heights. Early flight tests were modest sorties out of Hucknall, base altitudes rising from 15,000 to 25, then 30,000 feet. Pilots returned with cheeks flushed and speech clipped by disbelief. One wrote simply, "She breathes at altitude." Another, more poetic, scrawled in grease pencil on the hangar partition, "A Mustang with a Merlin climbs as though the sky is downhill." Numbers followed clean, brutal mathematics. With the Merlin, rate of climb leapt almost 30%. Ceiling pushed past 38,000 feet. Top speed rose to over 400 miles per hour at altitude. The laminar wing, once betrayed by an engine gasping for oxygen, now revelled in thin air. The British nicknamed it the Mustang Mark III. In American documentation, it would soon wear the designation P-51B. 2 letters, 1 transformation. Engineers at Packard in Detroit prepared to build the Merlin under license Packard Vone 650B and shop floors filled with the smell of cutting oil and lacquered harness looms. America's industrial lungs drew breath with purpose. Workers' farm boys from Kansas, daughters of Pennsylvania mill towns, machinists pulled from universities and garages, wound wiring looms, and torqued case bolts to tolerances measured in thousandths. The Heart, designed in Derby, became a production hymn in Michigan. And yet, the Mustang did not announce itself immediately. War seldom allows for tidy premieres. The first Merlins found their homes in quiet hangars and were ferried to units that still flew low-alt escort and reconnaissance missions. Pilots accustomed to stooping strikes against locomotive yards now climbed through ragged autumn clouds and found themselves level with fortress formations they once waved to from far below. Squadron debriefings turned from mournful to electric. 8th Air Force Memo, January, 1943. New P-51 performance suggests suitability for deep escort. Further trials recommended when drop tank capacity increased. There it was, the logistical shadow. Range, the same problem that clipped Spitfire wings, but the Mustang, even with the Merlin, retained its frugality. That laminar wing sipped fuel at cruise, and with jettisonable tanks slung under its belly and wings, the horizon stretched. Pilots reported something else, the feeling of inevitability. A Luftwaffe pilot could choose to turn, could choose to dive, could choose to climb. A Merlin Mustang could answer any choice. By spring 1943, whispers leaked across German intelligence channels. Fragments from Luftwaffe field reports, captured later by Allied translators. New American high-altitude fighter, excellent climb. Appears to be Mustang type, but superior to earlier version. Possibly British modification. Caution, fast in dive, strong construction. Unknown to those German analysts, history had pivoted on a decision never written into formal doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces had not asked for this hybrid. Rolls-Royce had simply seen the lines of possibility converge and acted. A rejected engine for high altitude in one program, a wasted airframe potential in another, and a war whose terms were being redrafted daily in blood and aluminum. It was not genius so much as inevitability meeting opportunity. In briefing huts across East Anglia, the chalkboards began to change. Escort throttles were marked not for short defensive arcs, but for deep penetrations. Bremen, Kiel, Schweinfurt, Berlin. Names once considered unreachable without catastrophic bomber losses now sat underlined like promises. Still, the transition was fragile. The Luftwaffe remained lethal, its veterans hardened by years across Europe and Russia. Oil pressure gauges still quivered, supercharger gears could still fail if mishandled, and pilots, even in better machines, still died in fire and ice when flak burst right or tracers walked true. But commanders saw it, a horizon bending. The Mustang, once condemned to hedgerows, now stood at the foot of the sky's throne. The RAF had given it lungs. Packard would give it numbers. American long-range doctrine would give it purpose. And somewhere in a ready room, a young pilot barely 20, eyes too old already, ran a thumb over a laminated altitude chart and whispered as though to the machine outside the window, "If the bombers must go to Berlin, we will go with them." Outside, a Merlin-powered Mustang idled, exhaust stacks flickering like the breath of an animal that had finally remembered what it was born to hunt. It had found its heart, and soon the sky would learn to fear its shadow. They met the enemy at heights where breath crystallized on oxygen masks, and the world below looked like a map half forgotten. The first Merlin-powered Mustangs crossed the Channel in the summer of life, 1943, not as curiosities or low-altitude raiders, but as predators, feeling their wings in new air. The 8th Air Force was learning the cost of daylight truth. Fortress formations pressing into Germany, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen bled aluminum and young men. Gunner turret glass cracked under cannon fire, wings sheared from stricken bombers, parachutes blossomed too seldom, escort arcs fell short, P-40s and P-38s turned back. Spitfires, gallant but thirsty, were forced home while the bombers pushed on alone. A phrase repeated in bomber messes, heavy as winter wool. "We can get there, but can we get back?" Then, one morning, contrails curled differently. At 28,000 feet, circling fortresses like faithful sheepdogs, a formation of slender-nosed fighters with tall tails and razor wings held station with the grace of creatures born to thin air. They carried a new hum, deeper, fiercer, confident. They were Mustangs, but no one who had flown alongside the Allison versions could mistake them. These were creatures of the upper sky. A B-17 tail gunner wrote in his diary, "They stayed with us. At 27,000, they stayed." The Luftwaffe noticed immediately. The first confirmed Mustang combat victories with the Merlin engine came in late summer, not dramatic dogfights at cloud top, but sharp, decisive strikes. Messerschmitts diving in from the sun found themselves matched in speed, in climb, in resolve. Focke-Wulfs, breaking through the escort ring, discovered that the slim-winged American fighter no longer floundered above 20,000 feet. In one early combat over the North Sea approaches, a staffel of Bf-109s attempted to slash through a bomber stream. A young Mustang pilot, barely 21, rolled inverted, dove, and reached firing position before the German leader could finish his first pass. The burst from his 6 Brownings was short, merciless. The Messerschmitt plunged in, flame, pilot never bailing out. His combat report ended in a line that would echo through the months to come. "They cannot outrun us now." German pilots felt it too, that subtle shift in the physics of pursuit. Jagdgeschwader reports, "Captured post-war, carried the tone of hunters suddenly aware another species had entered the forest, one larger and hungrier. New Mustang variant climbs strongly above 6,000 meters, turns adequately, exceptional dive, maintains energy better than expected. Do not attempt prolonged engagement above 5,000 meters unless with numerical advantage." The Luftwaffe did not fear many things at altitude. It feared this. Long-range escort tactics matured with the machine, no more orbiting like timid guardians. Mustang flights pushed forward, seeking interception, breaking the Luftwaffe's rhythm before enemy fighters could build attack momentum. They dived from altitude, fired, then climbed again, always above, always waiting. The Americans borrowed the boom and zoom kill logic perfected by P-48s, and honed it with greater reach and higher sustained speeds. Bomber crews noticed something they had never seen before: enemy formations turning away rather than pressing suicidally through defense fire. A waist gunner recalled, "They didn't come straight for us anymore. They looked up first." For the first time, bomber boys could drink coffee before takeoff without the metallic tang of dread. They could polish lucky tokens without needing to believe they worked. One fight spread by word of mouth across airfields from Norfolk to Debden, late September. A flight of 4 P-51Bs patrolled ahead of a returning bomber stream when a rotti of Fu 190As appeared, climbing hard from the deck. The Mustangs rolled, dove, and struck. The first German fell in seconds, wings ripped from roots by converging fire. The second, piloted by an ace from the Eastern Front, tried to escape, vertically his old trick against Spitfires, but the Mustang climbed with him. Foot by foot, the distance shrank. The German pilot kicked rudder, rolled spontaneously, dove, and still the American stayed at his tail. Only when tracers began touching his fuselage did he jettison canopy and throw himself into the sky. He survived, captured near Dutch dunes, and told his interrogators, "That is no low-altitude fighter. We were told wrong." Not all stories were triumph. Mustangs still fell tracers through radiators, flak-tearing wings, prop spinners corkscrewing into Belgian fields. But losses became lessons, not laments. Tactics refined, escort lines extended. Drop tanks improved. Pilots learned to ride the supercharger shifts, to coax every foot of altitude, to strike and vanish before cannon shells found their mark. And German pilots learned the sound, the high whistle of airflow around a laminar wing, the bark of 6 Brownings speaking in perfect sync. In October, a Luftwaffe radio intercept, translated by Allied listeners, carried a pilot's strained voice. "Achtung, new Mustang at altitude, cannot shake, God help me." The transmission cut. Silence followed. Above cloud tops, a Mustang's vapor trail curved home. By autumn's end, rumors whispered through mess halls and hangars, across polished briefing tables and damp dispersal pads. The Mustang can go to Berlin. No official order yet claimed it. No general yet stamped it, but pilots felt it in their bones. A ceiling had cracked. A war of attrition in the stratosphere tilted, slowly, brutally, toward Allied favor. The Mustang had entered the high cathedral of air combat. It did not kneel. It came to rule. The sky over Europe sharpened with winter, a steel-blue vault scraped thin by cold wind and contrails. Frost clung to Mustang wings like white lace as ground crews in heavy mitts yanked engine blankets away and checked glycol lines for crystalline death. Every morning felt like a gamble with the season itself. But the war did not pause for weather, and neither did the new escorts rising from English airfields. By December 1943, the Merlin Mustang had shed its debut innocence. It now flew with a certain kind of hunger, a confidence not yet arrogance but far from doubt. Commanders no longer debated whether the aircraft could escort bombers deep into hostile territory, they debated how far. Bremen? Munster? Brunswick? Yes. Berlin? Not yet, not officially. But every pilot who climbed into a cold cockpit and felt the Merlin pulse through the airframe sensed the inevitability. In briefing huts lit by dim bulbs and cigarette embers, mission maps stretched across walls like surgical charts. Arrows stabbed into Germany, red yarn marked escort transfer points. Chalk numbers recorded fuel burn, manifold settings, supercharger range bands. Crew chiefs stood by with thermos coffee, silent witnesses to the tightening coil of tension before engines woke. Pilots learned the rhythm, climb through slate cloud, level into blinding sun, join the fortresses, push ahead, wait for shadows to rise from the horizon. At 26,000 feet, the air tasted like needles through rubber oxygen masks. Ice formed on eyebrows inside heated goggles, yet the Mustangs held formation, silver-grey blades cutting the thin morning air. B-17s lumbered like iron whales beneath them, engines vibrating through the wings of their guardians. Waist gunners, noses pressed to perspex, watched the slim American fighters above, and whispered soft prayers not to be abandoned again. They would not be. The old era, the one where bombers flew past escort range into the wolves' teeth alone, was done. Across Germany, radar screens flickered, headphones crackled, and controllers at Freya and Würzburg stations leaned forward. The enemy was coming. Fortress tracks appeared on plotting tables. Pins marched toward industrial heartlands, and now a new signature road, with them fast, high, probing ahead like spear points. Luftwaffe pilots climbed into cockpits reluctantly, often without warmth in their flight suits, breath freezing on instrument glass. They still believed in themselves, in their machines, in years of triumph across Europe. But a creeping uncertainty gnawed at them. Fuel was scarcer, replacements younger, engines temperamental in cold air, and above all, the enemy fighters no longer vanished at the frontier. They came deeper, they came faster, they did not tire. One Staffel leader wrote in his log at Vernuken, "Mustangs again, high, always high. We cannot meet them on equal terms unless we climb with empty tanks. If we dive away, they follow. If we climb, they are already there." The mission on January 3rd, 1944, became the kind of story pilots carried with them for life. A flight of 8 P-51Bs, led by a soft-spoken captain from Texas, ranged ahead of the bomber stream near Oldenburg. Frost sparkled like ground glass on the wings. Radios hissed. Silence ruled. Then, black specks, climbing from the east, for 190 as. The Texans spoke barely 10 words. Tally-ho, stay high, make them climb to die. And the Germans did climb proud, competent, doomed by physics. Their radial engines strained, their prop tips whispering shock. Mustang pilots watched calmly as their adversaries rose into the killing altitude band. One misstep, one overpitch, one heat spike. That was all the Merlin needed. The fight ended in 90 seconds. 4 Focke-Wulfs spiraled down, 2 vanished in cloud, 2 fled. The Mustangs returned with frostbitten cheeks and fuel gauges close to empty. A ground mechanic, wiping oil from a cowl, looked at bullet-holed cowling and said, "How far did you go this time?" The captain answered quietly, "Farther than they thought we could. Trust is not won by order, it is earned in silence above flak clouds." Fortress crews saw Mustangs break away to chase German interceptors and then return. They saw them dive on climbing V-19s, tear through, then rejoin formation with ice frosting their noses and fabric peeling from control surfaces. They saw something else: discipline. The Mustang did not chase to exhaustion like a Spitfire duelist. It struck and returned, always mindful of its duty. After one mission, a B-17 radio operator wrote, "Before, we were bait. Now we are escorted." By February, mission planners pinned arcs that curved like claws toward the German capital. Fuel calculations filled blackboards minute by minute, gallon by gallon. Drop tank configurations refined. Pilots practiced fuel-lean climbs, oxygen discipline, and emergency dive recoveries from thin air compressibility. In a draft report to 8th Air Force Headquarters, the Mustang has changed the strategic equation. The bomber offensive need no longer end at the limits of escort fuel. It was not yet a promise, only a warning to Berlin. The Mustang had matured. The Luftwaffe had begun to sense the tide, and the great test, the one whispered in frozen hangars and smoky mess halls, waited just ahead, to Berlin and back again. The Mustang would go, and history would not turn away. The order came without ceremony, printed on thin paper that crackled in gloved hands. It did not shout, it did not boast. It simply listed target, altitude, timing, fuel loads, rendezvous points, bailout corridors, weather contingencies. The men reading it knew what it meant long before the last line. Primary target, Berlin escort, P-51, not attempted escort, not partial coverage, not to the frontier, to Berlin. Word travelled across East Anglia like electricity through wet wire. Mechanics paused over wrenches. Navigators lifted heads from charts. Gunners, chalking names on 50 cal ammo cans, murmured small prayers. Bomber crews had spoken of this mission like a myth. Mustang pilots, still young enough to feel history as adrenaline, checked their parachute harnesses twice. No one said it aloud, but every man understood. If the Mustang could carry bombers to Berlin and bring them home, the air war would tilt irrevocably. Dawn broke in pale streaks across frost-rimmed dispersal pads. Crews pulled engine covers, ground heaters hissed, and the first Merlin coughed, then roared 12 cylinders waking like chains pulled taut. Frost steamed off cowlings. Drop tanks were tapped and retapped. Fuel lines checked for ice. Mixture, prop, manifold, every movement deliberate. Pilots walked out in silence, gloved hands swinging maps and throat mics. They carried no swagger that morning. Not fear, either something heavier and cleaner. Duty carved into bone. At wheels up, the squadron lifted into a low mist that smelled faintly of sea salt and burnt glycol, then burst into sunlight above cloud tops like steel fish breaking through surf. They formed on lead ships, oxygen masks tight, fingers warming, on throttles. 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. Drop tanks steady, engines breathing cold purity. Ahead, like migrating giants, came the B-17s and B-24s silver herds lumbering toward destiny. The Mustangs slid above them, wings level, sunlight flashing off canopies. A Fortress waist gunner saw them and whispered to his crewmate, "They really are coming with us." German radar stations along the coast tracked the formation. Controllers raised headphones, lips tightening. Telephones rang in dispersal huts. Heavily jacketed pilots jogged to their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, boots slipping on icy aprons. Ground crewmen spun props, engines barked and coughed into life. The stage set. The hunters met the hunted and found the roles reversed. They came as they always did, specks at first, then black crosses against thin blue, then diving shapes. BF-109s in finger four formation, 4-190 as behind in reserve. Cockpits glinted, contrail tips curled. A German rotor leader keyed his throat mic. Amerikanische Höhenjäger very high. They wait for us. The old pattern strike the bombers, then fight free was gone. The Mustang enforced a new script. They dove first. 6P-51s rolled inverted and plunged like thrown spears. German pilots, accustomed to being wolves among sheep, suddenly felt talons in their own backs. The first burst shattered a 190's tailplane. The second cut through a Messerschmitt's engine and cockpit. The canopy blew off, the pilot tumbling into the thin sky like a rag doll. In the bomber stream below, cheers crackled over interphone wires. "Look at those bastards go!" A German ace 20-plus victories, Knight's Cross ribbon tucked under fleece collar tried to break upward into cloud. A Mustang followed. Even in thin air, the Merlin held breath where German pistons gasped. They climbed together until the German's nose faltered, engine coughing. The Mustang did not falter. A short burst, falling debris, silence. Later, American pilots would write it simply, "Engaged 4 over the Elbe. 1 destroyed, 1 probable, no losses." But diaries told the truth the after-action form could not carry. Today, the Luftwaffe looked over its shoulder. Bombers saw it first distant spires through high haze, Brandenburg rooftops dusted pale by winter. Smoke from flak bursts stained the horizon. The city that Hitler called inviolable, that Goebbels promised untouched, lay in the gun sights of hundreds of bombers guarded by fighters that refused to turn for home, Berlin. Searchlights probed uselessly. Flak peppered the sky in black eruptions. Mustang contrails arched like whip strokes above the storm. No dive away, no vanishing escort. They stayed. A Fortress radio operator later wrote, "We turned for home, and they were still there. Still there." Luftwaffe losses that week were the kind numbers do not hide. Dozens of experienced pilots gone, airframes burning on frozen fields, fuel stocks dwindling, training pipelines collapsing. An intercepted German line said it best, "Without fuel, without rest, and now without the sky." The Mustangs escorted the bombers back across the Rhine, across Holland, across the cold North Sea. Drop tanks long gone, internal fuel drinking into reserve, heaters failing in some cockpits. But every throttle push held promise now. If Berlin was reachable, everything was. They landed in dusk, wheels kissing frozen English soil. Ground crew ran out, canopies slid back, engines cooled with soft ticking. One pilot sat on the wing edge after shutdown, mask still hanging around his neck, face grey with fatigue and frostbite. A crew chief asked, "Did you get Berlin?" The pilot's answer was not a shout. It was quiet, almost reverent. "Yeah, we got Berlin." That night, bomber boys in muddy boots clapped Mustang pilots on the back, mess halls filled with applause instead of quiet coffee and empty chairs. Letters home were written with steadier hands. A chaplain who had buried too many young flyers exhaled and whispered, "They will live, many more will live." The Mustangs had not just kept pace. They had carried hope past a frontier no one believed in a year before. And in the dark offices of Luftwaffe Command, maps shifted, voices lowered, and a sentence carved itself into German air cables. The Americans now own the high sky to Berlin. The war had changed altitude, and fate had gone with it. The sky over Europe did not merely belong to the Mustang, it bent around it. Spring melted the frost from English hardstands, and with it vanished the last illusions inside the Luftwaffe that this was still their war to command from above. Once, German pilots had looked down with predatory certainty. Now they looked up first. In briefing huts across East Anglia, chalkboards carried a new phrase, spoken quietly at first and then with a pride. Pilots tried to hide behind clipped professionalism, Rangers in and out. Rangers deep penetrations, fighter sweeps ahead of bombers, cutting at the German fighter force before it ever saw a formation of B-17s. The Mustang was no longer merely an escort, it was now a hunter, and its prey wore black crosses. April came, missions multiplied, fuel trucks rolled day and night. Armourers fed belts of incendiary and AP rounds through. 50 cal feeds with the calm devotion of men who understood algebra written in aluminum and blood. Pilots carried maps marked not only to Berlin, but beyond to Leipzig, to Munich, to Vienna's doorstep. Orders: go first, kill fighters before they climb, leave nothing to reorganize. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare written in contrails. The Mustangs rose at dawn, often an hour before the bombers, slicing toward the Ruhr like silver strokes of intention. They no longer waited for threats, they hunted them, threading between cumulus towers where Messerschmitts liked to lurk, diving through sun glare where Fokker-Wulfs once hid. An American major summarized the new doctrine in 4 words: "We don't escort, we sweep." The change was devastating. German pilots lifting off found themselves bounced before their gear locked. Climb-out patterns turned into ambush zones. Airfields from Rhine to Paderborn to Jüterbog wore the scars of strafing passes so precise they felt surgical. Fuel bowsers burned, hangars collapsed. Maintenance crews ran for slit trenches as Mustangs came in so low they tore laundry from village lines. On April 8, 1944, Jagdgeschwader 26 tried to mass above the Emsland plains. 50-odd fighters, veteran leaders still at the helm despite dwindling fuel and exhausted mechanics. They were met by Mustangs in layered altitude elements, one squadron at 25,000 feet, another at 28, another at 30+. The Americans dove not in chaos but in orchestrated fury. In 11 minutes, the German formation ceased to exist as a coherent force. 12 aircraft fell, others scattered. Radio discipline disintegrated, calls of "break, break" bled into panic. An after-action line from a P-51 pilot read with cold simplicity: "Engaged enemy before they achieved fighting altitude, heavy losses inflicted. No bomber interference observed." A captured German pilot, dazed, said only, "We climbed into death." B-17 gunners began reporting something surreal. Quiet. Not silence, flak still blossomed, engines still droned, but the absence of swarms. One radio operator recorded, "We turned east of Magdeburg before meeting fighters. Never happened before." A pilot in the lead ship of a B-24 group wrote home, "We saw them, your Mustangs, coming back toward us from Germany. Not going in, coming back. The sky was ours before we got there." The 8th Air Force intelligence summary for May carried a single line that would echo in halls of strategy. Enemy fighter resistance diminishing in organized form. Diminishing. The Luftwaffe had not yet fallen, but it was cracking in the joints, like an old sword stressed beyond its forging. Luftwaffe field diaries from the period drip with exhaustion and dread. Fuel rations cut. Training flights reduced to glides and simulators. Replacement pilots Kindersoldaten, some barely 18, climbing into aircraft they had never fired in anger and likely never would again. One maintenance sergeant at an airfield near Kassel wrote, "Our pilots are brave, their fuel tanks are not." Another, bitter but precise, "They have machines for every altitude. We have gasoline for one sortie." The Mustang's arrival meant Germany now needed fighters just to defend its fighters. American pilots wrestled a dangerous temptation in those months, overconfidence. They felt the sky tilting, saw German formations crumble, watched enemy pilots bail out or dive for, clouds at the first glint of a bubble canopy. But their commanders, hardened men who had read casualty rosters too long, drilled humility. A briefing officer stood once before a squadron whose victory tally had doubled in a month. He held a chalk in one hand, silence in the other. "Boys," he said, "remember this. The moment you think they're beaten, one will kill you. Fly disciplined, finish your escort, fight smart, bring the bombers home." And so they did. By June, the English coast was a staging ground of impossible scale. Troop ships, LSTs, columns of trucks and tanks lined hedgerows. In hangars and dispersal pads, P-51s warmed for dawn sorties not over Germany but over Normandy, preparing to clamp the sky shut while the greatest amphibious armada in history crossed the Channel. The Luftwaffe would rise on D-Day, but it would rise into teeth, and when the first Mustang squadrons swept into the Cotentin sky that morning, hunting anything with a cross on its wings, one ground crewman in Suffolk thumped the side of a wing, smudging oil with a glove, and said, "6 months ago the bombers prayed for these ships. Now it's the Germans praying we don't come." The Mustang did not merely escort anymore, it dictated, it stalked. It strangled the Luftwaffe in the thin, unforgiving air where wars decide themselves, where engines gasp and men's lunges turn shallow, and the only thing sharper than the cold is the mathematics of kill ratios. And the Reich, once master of the air, found itself grasping at altitude it could no longer claim. The Mustang had not just joined the war, it was finishing what the Spitfire and Fortress had begun. Dawn on June 6, 1944 did not so much break as ignite. A blue-grey horizon simmered over the English Channel, metallic and cold, flecked with the wakes of thousands of ships pushing toward France. In fields from Cornwall to Suffolk, men in olive drab pulled on May Wests, checked flares, cinched harness buckles with trembling gloves. Engines kicked, coughed, then roared as if the earth itself had lungs. The P-51 Mustang, still young by war's measure, now stood ready for its greatest test, not above Berlin or Regensburg or Brunswick, but above a thin strip of French coastline suddenly destined to become the hinge of Western civilization. This was not an escort mission. This was suffocation. No Luftwaffe over the beaches. That was the order. Not reduce, not limit, none. Long shadows stretched from the wings as the first flights lifted into pre-dawn mist. Pilots tasted cordite and gum and fear through oxygen masks. Frost-kissed Merlin exhaust plumes curled like ghosts in the half-light. Mustang squadrons fanned southwest over the Channel, contrails trailing like chalk strokes behind a teacher's hand. Below, the sea boiled with steel destroyers, LSTs, barges, LCIs, even fishing vessels reforged into warcraft. Navy spotters lifted, binoculars skyward as P-51s slid past. A sergeant on a landing craft whispered, "If they stay up there, maybe we get to land twice." June wind slapped canvas. salt stung, and above it all, layers of Mustangs crossed and recrossed their invisible grid lines, each assigned altitude and sector like threads weaving a net for the Luftwaffe's throat. Inside Luftwaffe bunkers from Caen-Carpiquet to Dreux, pilots waited, helmets resting on maps, flight boots tapping. Some had flown the Channel Dash, had once been knights in cockpits. Now they waited for fuel that barely existed, and command orders that crackled with hesitation. A flight commander near Cherbourg muttered to his staff, "If we go, we die. If we stay, we lose." When the first scramble orders came, engines turned reluctant, choked by low-octane substitutes and starvation maintenance. A few Mi-109s lifted into grey air. They climbed straight into Mustangs. A pilot of the 9th Air Force later put it, without flourish. They came up like sparrows. We hit them like hawks. At 6:25, the Mustang grid tightened. Flak bursts rose from German coastal guns, black blossoms against the morning. But the real threat never arrived in force. A few Fol 190s darted low from inland. By the time they reached the beachhead, 2/3 never got close enough to see sand. Those who did saw something they did not expect, not helpless landing craft, but an airborne fortress dome, lightnings at 6,000 feet, thunderbolts lower still, and at 20,000+ feet Mustangs, silent, patient, predatory. A German pilot radioed his flight commander near Lisieux, "Wir sind im Käfig, we are in a cage." He was right. Mid-morning turned the Norman bocage into a patchwork of smoke and sunlight. Mustangs ran low, strafing columns, Kubelwagens overturning in ditches, flak crews scattering from camouflaged pits. But the true struggle remained above, where a few desperate German formations rose like moths into fire. One duel near Bayeux became legend among pilots. A starful of Focke-Wulfs, engines roaring in protest from fuel-starved tanks, dove toward a line of inbound C-40s carrying paratroop resupply. From altitude, a P-51 element peeled off, silhouettes cutting through cloud edges like strokes from a razor. No radio chatter, no frenzy, just geometry and velocity. 4 Germans fell in 12 seconds. 2 more fled into cloud. Pursuit left to another flight. The transports flew on. A pilot from the 352nd Fighter Group wrote that night, "We didn't win dogfights. We erased them." By noon, the Mustang wings thickened blue, silver, then sun-flashed chrome against cloud. They rolled into racetracks over the invasion corridor, sipping fuel lean, waiting for anything with crosses to break the sky. None came. Luftwaffe ground crews, hiding beneath camo nets near Évreux, watched Allied fighters streak low over hedgerows and whispered bitterly, "They fight in squadrons, we fight in singles." By dusk, Allied infantry dug into chalk and mud. Naval guns still thundered. Medical tents filled. Airfields behind the sands blossomed with pierced steel planking, bulldozers chewing the countryside into runways. And still the Mustangs circled. A B-25 crewman scribbled in his log, "Never saw the Luftwaffe today. Saw Mustangs every 10 minutes. Another voice, this from a German fighter controller at Beaumont-le-Roger, captured weeks later. Our screens showed American fighters stacked in layers. Like floors in a building, there was no way in. When the last missions landed, British twilight stretched long across the fields. Oilskins hung silent. Ground crews wiped gun streaks clean. Pilots slumped, masks still hanging around their necks, faces carved by wind and resolve. Not triumph, not joy, only acknowledgement. They had done the thing the invasion required, not heroically, not flashily, but relentlessly. A Mustang flight leader summed it over warm tin mugs of tea. Normandy belonged to the infantry, but the sky belonged to us. And the next day, and the next, and every day until Paris, and the Seine, and the frontier beyond, the Luftwaffe sought a return to relevance, and found only contrails and gun harmonization patterns, and the humbling truth whispered in briefing huts across England. We did not defeat them on D-Day, we erased their chance to matter. The Mustang had become more than an escort fighter. It was now a system part blade, part shield, part engine of inevitability. Above the blood-soaked sand of Omaha and the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, above glider tracks at Saint-Omer-Église and sunken lanes where airborne troopers fought for breath, the P-51 did the simplest, hardest thing in war. It denied the enemy a future. By autumn of 1944, the air war over Western Europe no longer resembled a duel. It was a harvest. Fields that once echoed with the thunder of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs now lay quiet, churned by tanks and dotted with steel-matte runways. The Mustang, once a stranger on this continent, now perched on forward airstrips from Normandy to Belgium, silver wings stained with oil and dust, exhaust rings scorched black like war paint. Every morning, before the sun warmed the hedgerows, P-51s clawed into the sky with 2,000-yard stares and drop tanks full. The mission board chalked their work in simple strokes: rodeo, ramrod, sweep, escort, search and destroy. In practice, each meant the same thing: go east, strike fuel, kill fighters, burn the Luftwaffe from root to branch. By late 1944, the Mustang's war became intimate with geography, with rivers and refineries rather than dogfights alone. No fuel, no Luftwaffe, no Reich. Orders came from the highest desks: Pollitz, Merseburg, Brooks, Berlin, Leuna. Each a name that meant one thing to a Mustang pilot: smoke columns, flak bursts, engines howling at 30,000 feet. Navigation lines crossed maps like veins. Pilots traced them with gloved fingers before dawn. They knew the price of error: flak belts over Cologne, swirling cloud banks over the Ardennes, the deceptive green beauty of the Rhine Valley below. A pilot of the 357th Fighter Group scrawled in his notebook after a September mission, "We don't fight planes now, we fight petroleum." And the Germans felt it. Every P-51 strike meant another gap in an already bleeding artery. Jet fuel stocks dwindled, training flights ceased, ground crews cannibalized aircraft on silent airfields. The Luftwaffe had once roared, now it coughed, yet not all skies were empty. Germany still had teeth sharpened and desperate. Messerschmitt Me-2610s surged from camouflaged revetments like steel wasps. Focke-Wulf 190s dove from cloud banks, with the malice of cornered predators. Jet Whispers Me-262s streaked across the horizon on rare, lethal sorties. But they flew fewer and fewer. Fuel drums were guarded like relics, engineers trained by candlelight, pilots with 10 hours total flight time strapped into machines designed for aces. Commanders wrote orders thinner each week, like bread stretched with sawdust. And every time a new pilot took off, a Mustang waited somewhere, at altitude, with time, with fuel enough to choose the moment. A German flight leader wrote in a diary recovered near Kassel, "They do not hunt us. They shepherd us to the slaughter." Autumn over Europe brought the weather's cruelty: cloud walls like fortresses, sleet that froze gun ports, ground fog swallowing entire squadrons. Winds of 80 knots clawed at wings, but the Mustangs flew. Pilots tasted metal and rubber through oxygen masks as they pushed through ice-bitten air. Frost-glazed canopies, superchargers screamed, engines coughed on start lines like reluctant giants, then roared to life. In Belgian fields, ground crews worked knuckles, raw, replacing cylinders in mud. Mechanics heated engines with braziers, drained oil like blood from a fevered body, refilled, retuned, rearmed. Each aircraft a living thing resurrected again and again. A sergeant from the 348th Service Group said simply, "Men break. Mustangs reload." When the great bomber streams rose again, flying fortresses and liberators stacked in glistening staircases across the sky, the Mustang did something old and something new. It escorted, and it hunted. Some flew tight with the forts, a halo of aggression and patience. Others roamed 3, 5, even 8 minutes ahead, cutting Luftwaffe formations like a farmer cuts wheat. Radio calls were efficient, clipped, cold. Angels 2 to 8, 11 o'clock, Vic of 4, tally, clear the bombers, let's scythe. A British observer at an advanced airfield watched Mustangs peel off to meet inbound German fighters and muttered, "They aren't flying combat air patrol. They're flying judgment." By November, the Rhine glittered beneath wings, and the distant smoke of the Ruhr hung like mourning cloth. Cities once names in geography schoolbooks now smouldered like open furnaces. Cologne's cathedral spires blackened but unbowed, Essen hammered steel and cinder, Dusseldorf ash-lined boulevards and hunger queues. Inside briefing rooms, chalk maps moved east, names slid toward Germany's heart. Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, Hanover, Koblenz, Berlin. The Mustangs' war was no longer defensive, it was invasive, surgical, inevitable. The bomber offensive, once exposed, bleeding, pleading for altitude and range, now travelled under a dome of American air supremacy so complete that gunners saw more condensation trails from friends than tracers from foes. A navigator of the 92nd Bomb Group said it aloud on a frozen morning, "We do not fear the Luftwaffe. We fear weather and God, and in that order." On a cold evening near Saint-Dizier, a P-51 flight returned fuel-starved, engines ticking like cooling anvils. The sky blushed purple, and a single lamplight flickered in the ops tent. A young lieutenant, barely 20, leaned against the wing root and stared east. His crew chief asked, "What you see?" He did not speak of targets or tactics or fuel states. He said, "Berlin, I think I can see Berlin from here." He could not, but he was right. The Mustang, the aircraft once dismissed as a low-altitude scout, rejected by altitude and strategy, now pointed its nose toward the center of the enemy world. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in a day, nor in a duel. It had been ground down, strangled, throttled by horsepower, strategy, fuel lines, and youth. And in the long shadow of autumn 1944, the P-51 was no longer a question mark. It was the answer.